Hi, friends. This episode is being taped before a live audience of the Hartman Institute's Giving Society, which are those people who are our most significant donors and who help the Institute exist and do what it does and directly and indirectly enable our podcast to do its work. So we're deeply, deeply indebted and grateful to you for all that you do for us. This is Donniel Hartman and Yossi Klein Halevi, and this is, for heaven's sake, Israel at War. And today is a year and a day, which sort of says everything. It's not 366 or 370, it's a year and a day. And what we chose for our podcast is the theme, We Are Not the Same. Throughout the year, we've analyzed the consequences. We've analyzed what we need to learn. Today, we want to talk about how Israeli society has changed. I'm aware of the fact that it's not just us, Jews around the world, Palestinians, so many people have changed because of this war. But today we're going to concentrate on how Israeli society has changed. But before we get into it on a personal level, I don't know what I would have done this last year without you.
Wow. Very mutual, Donniel.
It's how I thought, how I feel. Getting through this year together has made all the difference for me, and not just made it emotionally manageable, but also intellectually, even being able to understand, to be able to translate our feelings into thoughts. And so a year and a day has been a year and a day with you. So it's very, very much appreciated.
Well, being your chavruta, your October 7th study partner, has really forced me to go deeper. And knowing that I would be sitting with you once a week, sometimes twice a week, meant that I really needed to be sharp. And so thank you. Thank you for that.
So let's talk, because we're not the same. And in reflecting on today's podcast, what was the biggest change that I feel that happened this year? When I look at Israeli society, I look at myself, I look at you, I look at our students, I look at the thousands, tens of thousands of people that we've spoken to and the newspapers and all the information that we're collecting and experiencing. I think the biggest change is Israeli society is more emotionally fragile than I've ever experienced it since I've lived here in 71, including the Yom Kippur War, including the intifadas and the terrorist acts, and even including in the stories that we told about ourselves about the founding of the country. There wasn't a lot of room for emotional fragility, recognizing and giving place for feelings of brokenness. So much of Israel, I remember when I moved here when I was 13, and I immediately understood that there was no place for feelings. You're going to go into the army. It's it's not about you, Stu. It's almost, and I remember going through basic training, and the essential experience of basic training is to disconnect you from your feelings and from your desires, and to train you to do what it is that you need to do. And the constant training of basic training was that disassociation. And it became for me it was a paradigm of Israeliness. The model of the Israeli, so often you meet people from outside of Israel who came here and they have their favorite Israeli tour guide. This is like the mythic, some people speak about Israel through the taxi driver, and others, it's their tour guide, who's also their best friend forever and ever. And this person who accompanied them on their journeys, sometimes their first and sometimes over and over again. And the stories this person would tell, they're this larger-than-life individual with their chest hair coming out from every single corner.
They learn how to open their shirts in tour guide school.
Oh, I actually think it's a chest toupee. There's a chest toupee that they hand out. And these are people who in 73 fought simultaneously in Sinai and in the Golan Heights.
And they all liberated Jerusalem.
And they liberated Jerusalem and Tebbi. It's just this mythic person, this ahistorical, this was the persona of the Israel. Even the Sabra, in a certain sense, okay, it's complicated, but this year, the biggest change that I feel, wherever I go, You ask people how they're feeling, they can't tell you fine.
Yeah.
They don't even pretend. They say, people are telling me I'm depressed. I'm not fine. You see it. You see this emotional exposure on a level that almost feels antithetical to the Zionist mission. And it's really interesting to think about, which we'll do later on, what are the implications of that? By the way, it's very different than our government. Like Israeli society exhibits profound fragility. The government is the antithesis of that, which is an interesting thing we have to talk about.
They're still in tour guide mode.
They're still in tour guide. Maybe they're trying to guide Israeli society. Maybe they don't realize you only need that tour guide for the tourists. But it's almost shocking to me how emotionally exposed and open and hurt Israelis are and how they're willing to allow it into their life. Do you see that, Yossi?
Very much so, and how un-Israeli this moment feels. I was a student at Hebrew University during the Yom Kippur War. I moved to Israel at the beginning of the First Lebanon War. War is something that I associate with Israeliness, and the Israeli response to war is something that I've so deeply admired. That it's not quite stoicism. It's an ability to maintain the pretense of daily life, no matter what's happening. And you could go past the scene of a terror attack at a bus stop, for example, during the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. I remember this over and over again, going past bus stops where there'd been an atrocity 3 hours before. And there's not a sign. People are waiting at the bus, waiting for the next bus. And
they clean it. Everything is put back together.
Sterile. And what the cleanup crews managed to do physically is what Israeli society managed to project emotionally. That collapsed on October 7th. We lost our equilibrium. We lost our ability to maintain the pretense. As we say, yeh beseder, it'll be okay. Did you hear anyone in the last year saying that? Yeh beseder. It's the first war I haven't heard anyone say.
Interesting.
So there's something in
also not the term hakol beseder. Everything. The answer to how are you in Hebrew is hakol beseder.
Right.
It's like everything is okay. That also has been removed.
Yeah, my answer is chutz me'akol hakol beseder.
Which means
aside from everything, everything's fine.
Everything's fine. Yeah.
A friend of mine told me this story recently. She's online in the supermarket, and the cashier is crying. She's processing people. She's tallying up the amounts, and she's just crying. And my friend said that what struck her most was that no one online saw this as unusual. I have never seen that kind of raw display of emotion in Israel before, even during war, maybe especially during war. I find myself being unable to look at the faces of the hostages. If I look at their faces, I start to cry. I can't do it. I can't look at the footage. And look, I worked for years as a journalist. I can see hard footage, but not anymore. I've lost the ability to pretend that that I can take it. I'm strong.
Or that there's a distance.
Right. The filter is gone. And I think Israeli society has lost its emotional filter.
It's really interesting because I've been feeling that today. Today's Israeli society is filled with, just like North America's Jewish community, with events and commemorations. One of the things that the news has been doing is now giving us a multi-hour breakdown of everything that happened wrong on October 7th. I can't watch it.
Right. It's too much.
New footage, details, minute by minute.
I can't bear it.
I can't. Yeah, and part of it is I also feel like it's almost too. This is not a time we're reflecting, but very often you have days of commemoration a year later. But while this is a year later after October 7th, this is not a commemoration for an event that happened. We're still in the midst of this event.
So why? Why is it still October 7th for us?
It's because we're still fighting. Our hostages are still there. Our kids are still dying.
I think it's the hostages more than anything else.
You think it's the hostages?
Yeah,
that's interesting.
The helplessness.
I thought it had to do with the war, but maybe you're right. It is the hostages.
And it's not just their helplessness; it's our helplessness. Which is also so un-Israeli.
Like, so I feel like I'm supposed to commemorate an event that I'm still in the middle of.
Right.
So there's something, and that's why some commemorations are just singing. Our high school did an event. We were singing. Like, just sing.
The same heartbreaking songs.
Just singing.
Yeah.
Like, there's something very, as you said, the filters. We're in a different place. But if it's okay with you, I want to shift a little bit. And if you're not ready to shift yet, tell me, and that's okay.
I'm not ready for this conversation.
I'm not ready, by the way, is something that I've heard a few times from you in the previous podcasts. Now I footnoted, not even within the podcast, I'm now footing prior podcasts. I'm not just mentioning this sense of fragility. It's not just to describe, even though describing itself is important. I think this is having a profound impact on Israeli society, not just the fact itself. And it has so many consequences in Israeli society, which is not stoic, an Israeli society which exposes itself to some of its greatest fears and uncertainties. That has consequences for the nature of Israeli society and for the way we live our life. And I want to play them out. And I want you to think with you, what does it mean to have an Israeli society which is fragile in this level? Now, beyond the fact that we're not going to be the Ubermensch for some Disneyland trip to come meet this mega hero. And maybe, by the way, it'll also be much better for world Jewry. You'll have a more real relationship with Israel.
Oh, that's a very interesting guy.
But like that it's going to be very much harder to relate to it. But one of the implications for this fragility, and it might seem counterintuitive, is that Israeli society is more comfortable with a long war than we were beforehand. Beforehand, our wars, not just in fact that we had to win, our wars needed to be short, not just because for economic reasons. We had no tolerance for casualties for the last, it was after the Yom Kippur War, especially during Netanyahu's, the last 15 years, we loved Air Force wars. It's almost as if we told a story of our strength. We experienced it. We built this iron dome of status quo narrative, and we lived in this bubble. And that bubble broke. And paradoxically, I never thought that Israeli society would be able to fight a year-long war. I remember every operation that we had in the past. The minute the first casualties came in, the appetite for the operation disappeared.
Right.
This fragility almost has brought Israel back into a real world, a world with enemies, where the fact that we're feeling fragile is because our world is less secure. War has become part of Israeli reality again, precisely because of this fragility, and there's a strength and a willingness to engage in it. Now, part of it is, on every change that happens, there's positive elements, negative elements, and again, depends who you ask. But we're looking, war is a vehicle of Israeli political life again. We're trying to maybe mythically redeem ourselves from this fragility. When you feel it, it becomes part of life, and maybe you're looking for a way out from it.
Yeah, I see this in a different way. For me, there are two reasons. First of all, I think your insight is absolutely right. We have a newfound or renewed capacity for sacrifice. I see that as a sign of our resilience. But I think there are two reasons for it. The first is that this is the first war since Yom Kippur 1973 that feels existential. And every war we have fought since 1973 has been asymmetrical. And we all knew there was no real danger to the state. And so our tolerance level for casualties was much lower because the stakes were lower. The second reason is that we feel that we look at these sacrifices that civilian Israel has made. And the fact that hundreds of civilians were murdered in one day, something in our resistance to military casualties broke. And we were able to put military casualties into perspective. And it was an old Israeli perspective, that it's the army that defends the home front. And over the years, there was almost this strange kind of inversion where the home front is supposed to show a high tolerance for absorbing attacks, and we protect our kids, right? The soldiers are our kids.
We almost told a story we don't need an army.
Yeah. Yeah, or we talked about having a volunteer army.
And we didn't worry about the ultra-Orthodox.
Right.
We spoke about a smaller army, a high-tech army. It was going to be with a lot of buttons.
Right.
So it was going to be, so
it's all gone.
It's all gone. So on the one hand, Israeli society is stronger than ever before. Like you could see there's a strength. Together with this weakness, the amount, like when I look at a colleague of mine whose husband is going back, her husband was in for 160 days and is now going in for another 50 days.
That's the old Israel that we thought disappeared.
She, by the way, is fragile, but she's like, what are we going to do? And he's doing it. And this is not just, this is over and over and over again. So on the one hand, we have access to a resource that we took off the shelf. You're speaking about because of the existential fright. I think it has to do with, I think we're fragile, but I think we want to defeat our sense of vulnerability. And I think that's also what Netanyahu understands, and maybe understands correctly. And the poll numbers are showing that he's going up. Like, just persevere with full victory. Like today, he declared on what was his statement for today? His statement for today was, we are going to achieve complete victory and all our goals. And he gives the list. We are going to destroy Hamas. We're going to return our hostages. We are going to destroy Hezbollah. We're going to return like the whole list, as if everything is possible. And we know, but I'm feeling that when you're feeling vulnerable, you want this myth. So on the one hand, we're strong, but seeing again war and this military power as this overarching solution, precisely when you're more vulnerable, you want to access it more. And I get worried about, I've mentioned it throughout the year, but this vulnerability is giving us strength, but it's also exposing us.
So just to throw in another idea into the mix, the return of Holocaust discourse in Israeli society. Until October 7th, there was an appreciable decline in Israeli references to the Holocaust in relation to our security threats. The one exception was Netanyahu, who always refers to the Iranian nuclear threat in Holocaust terms. But in 2017, I was at a Holocaust Memorial Day ceremony at Yad Vashem, at the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. And President Ruby Rivlin, who is right-wing, Likud, delivered a rebuke to Netanyahu publicly. And it was an extraordinary moment where you had this deeply right-wing president saying the Holocaust should be kept out of our political discourse. That was really, for me, that was a watershed. Since October 7th, the Holocaust is back. And what makes this so complicated is that Israelis feel that the country that was supposed to ensure that there would never again be, etc., experienced some mini Holocaust on October 7th. Now,
Mini.
This is it.
Mini Holocaust.
Yes, so you and I have talked about this through the year, and we both agree that Holocaust imagery should still not have a place in Israeli discourse. We're too powerful for that. For me, it's demeaning. I don't like to hear Israelis refer to the casualties of October 7th as the largest number of Jews killed since the Holocaust. For me, the natural frame, the context for referring to October 7th is the largest number of Israelis, and I say Israelis and not Jews because there also were Arab citizens who were killed on October 7th, the largest number of Israelis killed in 100 years of the Arab-Israeli conflict. That's a pretty shocking statement. I don't need the Holocaust for that. But Israelis are falling back. They're
What does that
lapsing
mean?
into...
What does that mean? I'm with you. But can we unpack what that means? Because, when a society re-engages with a narrative that it saw itself as the antidote to, what is that going to do to us?
Israelis are saying we failed to defeat the past.
And what does that mean?
Back. I think this also plays into this feeling of emotional vulnerability. It's another layer of how Israelis don't feel anchored in the Israeli story anymore.
Let's play with it, because I think you're right. But let's think it through, because if you're speaking again in Holocaust language, do you remember last week I was speaking about peace with Palestinians and you said I'm not ready? You remember?
That was a week ago. I couldn't remember.
You weren't ready then. Maybe this week you're ready. But what happens when we speak in Holocaust language again?
Right.
What do you do?
It's very dangerous.
Is everybody your enemy again? Is it us against the world? Is it, part of Zionism was that we're going to enter into the nations of the world? Is that over?
Well, I'm going to channel Donniel for a moment and say that there's nothing more dangerous morally than a powerful people that considers itself powerless. And that's very, very complicated ground. And that's something for us to watch. And
I think more than watching, Yossi, we're going to have to deal with that, because if that's the case, it's then not by accident that ultranationalism is rising. From this sense of vulnerability, you go to a sense of Israel is now part of the larger experience of Jews culminating in a Holocaust, and now you're powerful, and your response is you can't see others. The other is Nazi. They're all Nazis. Everybody's a Nazi. So Nazis you don't have moral responsibility for. And Nazis you can't negotiate and make peace with.
And it's hard to see your own power. It's hard to see yourself objectively. What made Israel so effective in the past was that we were able to realistically assess the balance of power. And we knew, no matter what the threat, and we have lived through one existential threat after another here, but we always trusted our capacity for dealing with those threats. October 7th has upended our faith in ourselves, which is why, by the way, and we spoke about this last week, the return of our success and our ability to inflict such deep damage to Hezbollah is really important psychologically for countering this
vulnerability.
The return of Holocaust vulnerability.
It's interesting. Last week, there was that profound sense of empowerment. The year almost erased it. We were strutting. Israelis were strutting with our power. And now I'm not saying
I wouldn't call it strutting. I think we all felt this enormous sense of relief that we're back at the top of our game.
Yeah, I saw strutting. But in any event, either one, there was...
You weren't strutting.
No, I wasn't strutting, but I saw.
Even I was not strutting.
Whatever, it doesn't matter. But whatever it was, whether it's your language or mine, doesn't matter. I'll go with what you're saying. The commemoration almost brings us back.
Yes, it's erased the achievements of recent weeks.
It's erased the achievements of weeks. And it's an interesting challenge as we bring this podcast to a conclusion. What this vulnerability is going to do, is it going to activate, for example, a different political discourse? Or are we going to look for politicians who want to save us from this? Maybe if you're vulnerable, the vulnerability on October 7th caused Israelis to reach out to each other on ways that we thought we were now like every other, people were looking out for themselves and they wanted their house and their car and their own, that volunteering was off. Like we weren't there for each other. We were becoming a Western capitalist society. That vulnerability created a sense of civic responsibility, care, empathy. Remarkable.
No, I think this is really important what you're saying, Donniel, because a person who's in a place of acute vulnerability can go in lots of different directions with that. So, for example, you raise the specter of a further empowerment of the far right, and certainly people who are vulnerable tend to turn to extreme politics. We see it happening all over Europe. We see it, of course, happening in the United States.
Politics of fear.
We see it happening in the United States. And yes, that's happening here as well. But think of what happened after the Yom Kippur War, which was the last time I think that Israelis felt this vulnerable, although I think we are feeling even more vulnerable than we did then. But there was a certain sense of shattering of we can't take anything for granted anymore. We can't take our own power for granted, even though Yom Kippur was one of our greatest victories.
That's right.
But we didn't internalize it at the time. And the Yom Kippur War led to Israel's first peace agreement with Egypt. Now, that required an Arab partner. And we certainly don't have that among the Palestinians today. We don't have a peace government in Israel, and they certainly don't have a peace leadership. But there are forces in this region, Saudi Arabia, most prominent among them, that are looking for ways to finalize a normalization agreement with us. So I'm wondering if that sense of vulnerability can lead us, many of us, in that direction.
You know, maybe one way, I just thought of this now, maybe one of the big divides in Israeli society today are those who are embracing the vulnerability as a new part of their life and those who want to repress it and go back to the old experience. And those who want to repress it are not going to want to look for, I want to go back to, we need full victory, we're going to survive by our power, we're going to do all of that, and that the desire to repress it is going to move us away from looking for other solutions, while those who recognize it are, okay, if I'm vulnerable, so maybe the Sunni coalition is a good idea. But if I'm not, I don't need a Sunni coalition, they need us. And part of what you see is that this is a government, by and large, which has no place for the vulnerability conversation.
Right.
And there's a huge dissonance between a large segment. It's not judicial reform. It's not even who's responsible for the war. It's a different response to the shift in Israeli society.
Right.
One is going with where it is and saying, what are we going to do? Maybe we need new coalition agreements. I was just watching at the ceremony today in the high school, there was this beautiful video of Kibbutz Be'eri, which I apologize if I don't remember the exact numbers. Over 100 people were killed.
100 people out of 400.
And they had, I forget the exact number of people, over 20 who were taken hostages. And there were these 3 religious Zionist nationalist settlers who heard from the settlement of Donniel, who heard what was happening. They were in south of Beit Lechem, near the Hebron area. And on their own, they drove in a jeep and went to war. They weren't part of a unit. They were armed as settlers. They had automatic.
There are so many stories like this.
But these people literally went from house to house in Be'eri and saved over 100 lives. And they told the story. And at the end, you see one of the heroes died, and the other 2 came to their kibbutz, to their hotel in the Dead Sea, where they were staying still at the time.
Where the uprooted
went.
Right.
And you just see the moment. It's like, I'll leave the emotion. You just watch it. But at the end, this man, the head of the kibbutz, and the kibbutz is a secular left-wing kibbutz. And he says, we, in our life before October 7th, we had nothing to do with each other. We were on different sides of the map, and we even vilified each other. And he said, but I want you to know, you saved us. You came. You didn't make a distinction between left-wing and right-wing, between Orthodox and non-Orthodox. You came and saved us. And I want to tell you that in the future, we're going to rebuild, but now we're going to rebuild, and we're going to rebuild together. This was this moment in which I want to I want to live with you. Now, it's so interesting that is part of what Israelis are feeling. And another part, we've returned to this political divisiveness again. Maybe I think this vulnerability is going to have so many implications on so many things. Do we look at a national unity government in a different way? I want full victory. What's the story? Yossi, last thoughts or comments?
I so much appreciate you bringing in the story of Be'eri, because it reminded me, throughout this episode, we've been analyzing. We've been analyzing the emotions as if somehow we're not part of this. We're, as we say in Hebrew, the UN. We're peacekeeping observers. And what I felt listening to that story And really what I've been feeling all day, walking around, seeing what everyone is going through and not concealing it, is how proud I am to be part of this society. What a privilege it is to be an Israeli and to be carrying this unbearable emotional load with everyone. Now, yeah, it doesn't mean that we're all in love with each other and, Am Yisrael Chai, and we're all waving flags together. We're not. That's not
Am Yisrael Chai, the
Jewish
people.
people live. We're not in the slogan period here. It's so much deeper and more real and more vulnerable than that. And again, this can go in so many different ways. But right now, what I'm feeling on this 366th day is gratitude. Gratitude to be able to be broken among my people.
With other people. Thank you, Yossi. We're not the same. How we're going to continually, what are the new changes and the new shifts that this is bringing to our society is going to be something that as lovers of Israel, we're going to have to watch and see and also try to guide. It's not the same country it used to be. We're not the same people. Maybe with you, I think with this vulnerability, there's great opportunity, but you need wisdom. This is, for heaven's sake, Israel at war, 1 year, 1 day. Every day that our hostages are still there is just unbearable.
It's October 7th.
It still sits heavy.
Yeah.
It still sits heavy. Be well.
Thank you both.
We have an audience.
Audience of 60 people watching you and listening to you. And we have a few questions that I think we might be able to get to. The first question, there was an article in the Times of Israel that 25% of Israelis are now starting to think about leaving the country. Are you hearing similar sentiment?
So I'll tell you, from my own personal experience, my son was living in Brooklyn for the last 7 years. My son Shachar, he is a jazz drummer, and that's one of the places to be. And after October 7th, he began feeling more and more uncomfortable and more pulled home. And last month, he moved back. He ended his Brooklyn life and came home.
Is that maybe the grass is always greener? It's
and
like,
so,
people in Brooklyn said, like, I've had it.
Yeah.
So they want to leave Brooklyn.
Yeah,
but people in
maybe.
Israel think that Brooklyn sounds pretty good.
Maybe, but just, and again, this is just anecdotal. And that's not to minimize the very serious problem of rising immigration. But what I'm trying to say is I think that it's a very unstable picture. I think we're going to see some Israelis coming back. Maybe we're going to see an uptick in Aliyah from different places. And we're going to be losing more people than we can afford to.
Aliyah officially is down, the numbers, especially from North America. I don't know the percentages, especially in a time people are sharing feelings that they wouldn't. Could be that a lot of Israelis thought, now it's allowed to talk about it. I think I could just see in my circles, there are people who are saying, what future? And by the way, it's not just the war, it's also the Smotrich Ben-Gvir phenomena and the Netanyahu phenomena. It's part of that story that, listen, I have my daughter went to visit her friend who moved to Paris. I was worried that my youngest daughter is on the far left side of the spectrum. And at what point is she going to feel that this is just not my country anymore? So there is, again, relating to this issue of how do we readjust and build a Zionism in which this uncertainty and fragility is okay, or it doesn't mean that everything is broken. It's not an irrelevant statistic. Like, all statistics, I've never found a statistic that is like 100%, that they're really correct. It points to an issue. And I think you're very, very right to raise it. It's not simple. How does Israel reclaim a story of excitement and love and future? Remember, Israelis have more children than any other Western country in the OECD. Most OECD countries, they have birth rates of 0, almost not even 1. Here, 4 is the new 3. that's a sign of hope and a future. There's something happened. And
it did begin during the judicial period.
Yeah. So the floodgates aren't open, but it's something to watch. What does Zionism mean in the midst of all of this? It's not an irrelevant question. It's a good one. Thank you.
Given the escalation in fighting, is general public opinion about the Haredi exemption from service shifting in any material way?
I think it has become a consensus. It may be the only consensus issue in the non-Haredi, non-Arab world here. Everyone just about feels a sense of profound frustration to acute outrage.
Absolutely. It's like that's a price that can't be paid anymore. But here, the problem is that it's a consensus that they have to be drafted, and the reality is that they won't be, because you can't force this. You can't solve the problem through legislation. So nothing's changing. And so there's this clash now between this reality that won't change and now a given consensus. And Yossi's right, across the board, like nobody has any tolerance for it anymore. Outside of the Haredi community, they're completely isolated. But at the same time, Gideon Sa'ar comes into the government, and now the government is going to be able to possibly pass this type of legislation. So this used to just be a barter issue. This was something we could sell. I haven't met anybody who is not enraged by this issue when it really wasn't essential. It was like always bothered you. But it wasn't a core issue in Israeli political life.
There was a letter a couple months back signed by 1,000 religious Zionist mothers, an open letter to ultra-Orthodox mothers. Why are our sons on the front lines and your sons aren't? Nothing like that has ever happened before.
So many of us, Americans and Israelis, are feeling confused and fragile. However, it seems that part of the Israeli population, mainly the right wing, in quotes, in Israel, seem to have retained an amazing amount of certainty in their narrative, in their strategic goals, and maybe in their politics. From your perspective, is this true? If so, what are the implications that you see?
It's always the case that people of intense ideological passion, sometimes you break. Don't think that some of them aren't breaking. Just like the greatest moments in assimilation in Jewish history in the last 200 years always took place from the ultra-Orthodox community. At the beginning of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, when millions of Jews left, they left ultra-Orthodoxy to secularism. When you have a choice of all or nothing, sometimes you keep with all and sometimes you just opt out. So there is, on the ultra-nationalist side, very clear, let's fight one more day. There's certainty. Many of them see this as part of a larger messianic move. All of that is there. And so it's true. There is a certain sense of fortitude that you have and certainty. And they look at all the rest of us as this is what secularism or this is what modernity creates, these weak. But they're not immune to it. They're not immune to their mothers and fathers aren't immune to having their children or spouses going but it's true. They're very happy if a bunch of liberal secularists, what in Israel they used to call the Tel Aviv Jews, will move to Portugal or to Berlin. But it's interesting that when it came to the 150% call-up, that was across the board. But again, when somebody exposes their vulnerability, or let's use another example. When I say I'm tolerant, when I say I'm not sure, the attack is, I want an answer. So the non-pluralist is able to weather doubt unless they break. In the short run, this will also be part of the Zionist discourse. Who's the greater lover of Israel? The one who's vulnerable and questions? I wonder whether the 20% who are considering to leave, are they leaving or are they questioning? See, questioning isn't always leaving. It's not always leaving. That was the mistake we make in the Pesach Seder when we say that the wicked son is the one who says, what is this worship to you? Oh, they left to you, not to him. They're just questioning. They don't know. And by the way, it's the same thing with so many Americans. Like, why do I need Israel? It's a question. It's not yet a rejection. But in this sweepstakes of who's the greater lover of Israel, I'm going to win type sweepstakes, it's not an insignificant factor.
Well, I find the ideological self-confidence of the Orthodox community here astonishing. This government, which brought us to the abyss, the most failed government in Israel's history by far, is also Israel's first Orthodox government, not in name, but in practice. Its agenda is primarily Orthodox. The coalition Knesset members, majority Orthodox. And this is...
Even in the Likud, by the way. This is not just in the Orthodox parties.
Yes, and that's new. And so there's something in this exaggerated self-confidence of Orthodox Jews that I think is deeply incongruous, and they're not looking at reality. And one of the things that's so disturbing for me about the Orthodox community is that the community is able to produce a very high-level persona. People who look at themselves, who examine their behavior, their thoughts on a daily basis, and are always questioning themselves. There's a very high level of self-criticism that's happening on an individual spiritual level. But as soon as you take Orthodox Jews from being individuals to being a collective, their ability for self-reflection disappears. And instead, it's everyone else's fault. It's always this government. October 7th, it was the people demonstrating against the government. It's their fault. It was Bennett's fault. It was Sharon's fault for withdrawing from Gaza. It was Rabin's fault for trying to make peace with the Palestinians 30 years ago. It's everyone's fault except the people who've been in power. And so there's something here that I feel is unsustainable. And I think, what you were saying, Donniel, about the cracks that happened in the late 19th century, 20th century within the Orthodox community, I think we are overdue for the next round of disaffection.
Again, just to share when I have a fact that actually supports my opinions, I love putting it forward. Like, what's better than that? Whether the fact is true or not doesn't matter. But it's important. There is some interesting facts. Close to between 35 to 40% of children in the religious Zionist community leave the religious Zionist community.
Right. They don't leave the right wing.
They don't leave the right wing, but they're
right.
they're not messianic ideologues.
Right.
They stop. That's one interesting fact.
Yeah.
So that's just, again, it's an ideology has great difficulty sustaining itself. It's not the settler going to war. It's not the same. There's another interesting, this is more anecdotal. I just learned this 2-3 weeks ago. I have a step-granddaughter, and she comes from the right-wing side of the religious Zionist community. And she's doing her post-high school service. They don't go to the army, but they do national service. And she's doing 2 years of national service as the head of B'nai Akiva, which is the religious Zionist flagship youth movement, in a settlement near Ariel. It has a name, I never heard it before. It turns out it has a few thousand people in it. And she just started her service. And the first Shabbos, she's supposed to, it's called the Kommunar, which is an old communist, she's the head of this.
She's the Kommunar.
How do I say that in English?
Well, really the organizer.
Of this group. Hundreds of kids come on Shabbos, that's their youth group. Her first Shabbos was canceled because a bunch of the youth ran around inside the youth group's building with steel wool on fire and caused damages. They injured kids and more or less vandalized the place. This is an Orthodox settlement, mainstream Orthodox, religious Zionist, the picture of the whole story. And I look and says, what's going on here? What are you, crazy? This happened? She says, what do you mean? And she says, the Shomronim, everybody knows, they're crazy. There's drugs. There is this subculture, again, when you have
they're not literally Shomronim.
She says, but it's
that.
known. She said the settlements in the Shomron have a huge delinquency, drugs, violence, and these are mainstream religious. So every group When it's so, first of all, whenever I see a problem with someone else's kids, it's like everybody says, blames me. So it's like, it's very nice. But it's interesting when you're holding on to this pure ideology, who is it who says the emperor has no clothes? It's always the kids. So it's a story. By the way, it's the same thing with the ultra-Orthodox. Time will tell to see how significant or how much they're able to sustain this ideological purity.
One last question. What music are you listening to?
There's a great new album by Evyatar Banai, who may well be this generation's greatest Israeli poet-singer. It's competition among all the Banais. There's Ehud Banai, there's the late Meir Banai. I vote for Evyatar. And this album, for me, is the great album of the war. Don't get me started, because we'll be here for another hour. But what he does in this album, first of all, he is one of those people who moved into the ultra-Orthodox world. He grew up secular, and it was one of the major cultural events of his generation when he became ultra-Orthodox. In this album, he has a song which is signaling his deep disaffection with ultra-Orthodoxy. It's a fantastic song. And he has one line on there saying, "I'm dying of thirst. I'm desperate for truth. And all you can think of is trying to put a suit on me, a black suit." It's a fantastic song. He has another song there where he's describing being in a hospital room with the parents and this boy, a soldier, who's dying. And as Evyatar is singing, he says, "We're watching his soul leave the body." This album, I just get overwhelmed thinking about what an extraordinary work it is. So it's called Sichot Shalom, which means peace talks, and he means peace talks among the Jews. And just one last song, just to orient you. He compares Israeli society to a 12-step meeting. And he has every sector of Israeli society is represented by another addiction. So the Haredi is addicted to gambling. The religious Zionist is addicted to drugs. And it's fantastic. The secular is addicted to money. And everyone is sitting in this room. And he's in the room too. He's dealing with his problems too. And the refrain of the song is, "We love you," and it repeats the name, "Ohavim otcha Evyatar." We love you, Evyatar. Ken Ohavim. And then as the song goes on, you realize that this 12-step meeting of all of these representatives of Israeli society is happening in an air raid shelter. And he has a line in there where he says, "What a tragedy it will be if we emerge from this war no different than we were before the war."
Without over-trivializing, I've been spending a lot of time with my grandchildren, 2 granddaughters, and they're Swifties. So I'm forced to listen to every time I get in the car. And can I officially tell you, I don't get it. I just don't get it. I don't understand it, but I don't want to trivialize too much. But Yossi, thank you. And to all of you in our giving, you're our people. You're the ones who help us do what it is that we do. And we're deeply, deeply grateful for you and to you. So may we have a good year, my friends. May you have a better year.
Shana Tova to everyone.
Shana Tova.
Sending an embrace to everyone.
You can now sponsor an episode of For Heaven's Sake, Israel at War. The link to donate can be found in the show notes or at shalomhartman.org/For Heaven's Sake. We will acknowledge your gift on a future episode. For more ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute about what's unfolding right now, sign up for our newsletter in the show notes or visit shalomhartman.org/Israel at War.